thought I'd go through the carbon cycle stuff and succession stuff one more time for you. So the carbon cycle is much easier than the nitrogen cycle because there's not as many steps, there's not as many things with horrible names. So the carbon cycle, basically the carbon's in one of four places. It's in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, or it's in the biosphere either in plants or as animals as organic compounds like carbohydrates or phosphates, sorry, not phosphates, or nucleotides or lipids or whatever the organic compound is. Or it's in the soil as dead organic matter, all those leaves that we talked about that fall off the trees in autumn are the obvious source of that. Or it's in the ground as a fossil fuel. So what you need to understand basically is how the carbon moves between these. We call these reservoirs and reservoirs of carbon. How the carbon moves between these reservoirs and what the balance of these processes that move the carbon between the reservoirs is on a daily, on a yearly, and on a much longer term basis. So the processes, then, you were quite right. It's I don't know what's going on here. There we go. It's photosynthesis that moves carbon from the atmosphere to the biosphere. So plants take carbon dioxide in through their stomata, and then the process of photosynthesis uses that carbon dioxide to synthesize to make carbohydrates like glucose, and then from glucose, other carbohydrates like sucrose or maltose or complex carbohydrates, polysaccharides like cellulose or the elements of starch, amylose and amylopectin would be synthesized. So we've gone from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to carbon in organic compounds in the biosphere, and that's photosynthesis. Now clearly we could also look at how the carbon moves along a food chain from producer to consumer, but that's probably more detail than we need. And then the carbon is returned to the atmosphere by the process of respiration. So in respiration, either glucose or some other respiratory substrate is used as a source of energy to synthesize ATP, and carbon dioxide is a waste product that's returned to the atmosphere. So that's going to happen on a sort of daily basis. Photosynthesis is going to draw carbon dioxide from the atmosphere while there's light, and then respiration will return it at all times. And then sort of on a sort of more yearly basis, really, the biosphere gives carbon in the form of dead organic matter to the soil. And in our climate, that's very much a seasonal thing, isn't it? That's an autumn thing when all the leaves fall off the trees. But it's happening all the time. Bits of plants are falling off all the time. Poop's coming out of horses all the time. Dead organic matter is accumulating all the time. And then bacterial respiration or microbial respiration. Remember, a microbe is a small organism, so they're usually bacterial fungi. So microbial respiration or bacterial respiration or decomposition, it all means the same thing, will return the carbon from the dead organic matter back to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. So that sort of cycle has more of a sort of a yearly sort of rhythm to it. In the spring and the summer, photosynthesis is pulling more carbon out of the atmosphere than respiration from the soil organic matter, and respiration from the biosphere is returning. And then in the winter and the autumn, the opposite is true. There's not much photosynthesis because light levels aren't high and temperatures are low. And respiration from the soil and respiration from the biosphere is putting more carbon back into the atmosphere than is coming out by photosynthesis. And then if we want to look on a longer time scale, again, we want to involve fossil fuels. So the process of fossilization takes solid carbon and converts it to oil and coal and gas. And then combustion converts fossil fuels back into carbon dioxide and they're released to the atmosphere. And of course, those are the sorts of changes we're talking about since the Industrial Revolution, since about 1850, where human beings have been burning fossil fuels much, much faster than the rate at which new fossil fuels are formed, like hundreds of millions of times faster. And that carbon is being added to the atmosphere and is the reason, of course, why the climate and the atmospheric composition have changed over our lifetimes. So then they expect you to understand basically this balance in terms of daily changes, and typically it's a graph like this, and you're looking in the graph for points where photosynthesis and respiration are balanced, in which case the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is not going to change, so really between about midday and about 6 or 7 o'clock on this graph. And then periods when respiration is faster than photosynthesis, and that's clearly going to be when it's dark, or you can just look at the graph and go, I'm adding carbon to the atmosphere by respiration faster than it's being taken out by photosynthesis. So that on this graph is from about 7 o'clock at night till about 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. and then periods where carbon dioxide is generally coming out of the atmosphere and into the biosphere faster than it's going back in. So that would reduce the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. So we're talking from about, I don't know, 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning through to about midday on this graph. Okay, daily changes. We're looking at the balance between the atmosphere and the biosphere, the balance between photosynthesis and respiration. Annual changes, we're looking at the balance between really decay and photosynthesis. So dead organic matter in the soil builds up during the spring and the summer months, and then in the winter months, after the big great dump of dead organic matter in the autumn, it all decays and returns to the atmosphere. And we can see that clearly in this graph. We can see that in the autumnal and winter, and even actually the early spring months, October, November, December, January, February, March, April, May, the rate of respiration, mostly from the soil, but also from the biosphere, is greater than the rate of photosynthesis. So carbon is going from the soil dead organic matter and from the biosphere, but mostly from the soil dead organic matter into the atmosphere. So carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere increase. And then May, June, July, August, September, the opposite is happening. Carbon is coming out of the atmosphere faster than it's going back in. And that because photosynthesis is faster than the combined effects of soil and biosphere respiration. And we said that the reason why this pattern isn't balanced out by what's happening in the southern hemisphere is that the northern hemisphere has more land in it, so the northern hemisphere has a bigger effect, and we notice the northern hemisphere signal, not the southern hemisphere signal, which is kind of drowned out by the amount that's going on in the northern hemisphere. And then we said, okay, well, we can now look at much longer time scales, in which case we need to involve the fossil fuels. And we can see in this graph, the wobbly up and down red line is that yearly cycle we've just been looking at. And the black line shows the average for the year. And we can see that the average amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has increased. So I didn't mean to say this to you, and I forgot while we were doing it. I was born in 1967. When I was born, the carbon dioxide concentration was about 325 parts per million. The carbon dioxide concentration has now gone off this graph. Last few years ago, it went through 400 parts per million. I don't actually know what it is at the moment. I've stopped looking. It's too depressing. So the carbon dioxide concentration in my lifetime, and I know I'm old, but I'm not that old, has increased by about a third of what was there before. And if you think about that, if we added about a third as much water as there is in the oceans again, we'd all be living under a kilometre of water. So it's quite a substantial change to what's in the atmosphere, and that's because the rate of combustion of fossil fuels is taking carbon from the fossil fuels and dumping it into the atmosphere much faster than it's coming out, much faster than the process of photosynthesis can draw that carbon out of the atmosphere and lock it away in the biosphere or the soil dead organic matter or long-term fossilization. And then we said, well, we can look at even bigger timescales by drilling into Antarctic ice, extracting bubbles of gas that were trapped when the snow fell in Antarctica. We can date it by counting layers. So we can work out what the carbon dioxide concentration has been in the Earth's atmosphere over the past. It actually goes back longer than this now, but this one goes back about 640,000 years. And we can see that the recent changes, geologically recent, since 1850, it just looks like a straight vertical line on the map, on the graph, sorry. We can see there's like substantial changes. I'll move the mouse, here we go, look. These really fast changes in carbon dioxide concentration. We can also see they're off the scale compared to how much carbon dioxide there's been in the atmosphere over the past 640,000 years, according to this graph. In fact, we now think that actually there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than there has been probably for about 40 million years. So it is actually quite a high level of carbon dioxide. Okay, that's pretty much all you need to know about the carbon cycle. I would make sure that I could draw the carbon cycle out with all the processes on it. I put the carbon cycle stuff into the flashcards and it's in the blurting list now. But I would, if I had to learn this, which obviously at some point I did, I just drew out the diagram until I could do it. Sorry, slurp of tea. Right, enough of carbon cycle. I'm going to stop this video and I'll do another video for succession so you've got two separate things so you don't have to look at them together.